NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
Hi, I'm Vanessa Antoun, Senior Resource Counsel for the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, and I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to this presentation, Defending Veterans in Criminal Court. NACDL is proud to present instruction on this important topic, and especially from the expert speakers we have here today. This is available online for your on-demand viewing, and please check out the other programs that we have on similar topics for your viewing as well. So to kick things off, I would like to introduce you to both of the expert speakers you're going to be hearing from today. First of all, we have Brockton Hunter, who's a criminal defense attorney based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. With more than 10 years of criminal defense experience, Brock Hunter has handled thousands of cases ranging from first-degree murder to DWI. He's been named a rising star in the area of criminal defense by the Minnesota Law and Politics magazine from 2006 through 2009. Brock currently serves on the board of directors of the Minnesota Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers and, as their legislative chair, leads efforts for criminal justice reform at the Minnesota legislature. Brock is also a veteran who served as a recon scout in the U.S. Army. He now devotes a significant portion of his practice to representing psychologically injured Iraq and Afghan war veterans who find themselves in the criminal justice system. Brock has handled a number of high-profile veterans cases, including a homicide case profiled in the New York Times. In 2008, he drafted a lead passage of the pioneering Minnesota legislation that encourages treatment over incarceration of veterans whose psychological injuries played a role in their criminal offense. Brock regularly speaks across the country on the issue of combat veterans in criminal courts, educating legal professionals, lawmakers, and military members on how we, as a nation, can avoid mistakes made with past generations of veterans and truly support our troops. After we hear from Brock, we'll then hear from Carrington. Karen is a social worker at the Department of Veterans Affairs Medical Center located here in Washington, D.C. She was born in New York but raised in Cleveland, Ohio. Karen obtained her bachelor's degree in history from Oakwood University in Huntsville, Alabama, and then attended the University of Maryland, Baltimore, where she earned her master's in social work. Since graduating in 2003, Karen has worked in the Washington VA Medical Center, initially as a social worker in acute and ambulatory care, and then spent 5 years under the geriatric program as the social worker for the rehabilitation unit and respite care coordinator. Karen then began her current role as Veterans Justice Outreach Specialist in 2010. In that role, she has cultivated relationships with local area jails to ensure notification of veterans that have been arrested and detained, whereby she can enter the jail and meet with those veterans to ascertain their charges and quickly notify the courts of those individuals' eligibility for mental health and substance abuse services. Karen also provides education to local area judges, law enforcement officers, and attorneys on the programs available for the VA. So now we'll turn it over to Brock to start us off with this presentation. Thanks, Brock.
Thank you, Vanessa. I appreciate you all tuning in for this coverage, and to Jerry Cox for his leadership as president of NACDL this year in drawing attention to these special considerations in defending veterans in criminal court. The talk you're going to hear today is a pretty condensed version of a longer talk that I give on this subject. You'll find much more information in the materials provided, which are 2 articles we've recently published in the Champion, as well as a treatise that I've been part of working on for the past 3 years that has just recently been published that goes into far greater depth on all of these issues, and I'll refer to it throughout my presentation. As Jerry indicated, we have a war that is just now winding down. In fact, we've been fighting the 2 longest wars in our country's history simultaneously over the last decade, and we're now entering into the aftermath of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And as we do so, I think it's apropos to look back at the aftermath of the last major conflict, Vietnam, to give us a sense of what we have coming ahead of us in the next few years. As Jerry indicated, half or so of the 3 million Americans who served in Vietnam came home with long-term psychological injuries related to their service. According to a study done by the VA in the mid-1980s, half of the veterans it was treating for post-traumatic stress had had some contact with the criminal justice system. And of course, Vietnam, especially by the end of that war, was very unpopular with the American public. And when our veterans came home from that war, they often received a less than warm homecoming, particularly when they came back home, bringing their war home with them and acting out against their own communities. Studies show that on the whole, Vietnam veterans were treated more harshly in the American justice system than had they been civilians who had committed the same crimes. Even today, 40 years after the end of the Vietnam War, those policies of locking veterans up in cages, hoping that would solve the problem, continue to ripple throughout our society, with hundreds of thousands of Vietnam-era veterans still incarcerated, homeless, and addicted 4 decades after their war. And as Jerry indicated, suicide was rampant in the wake of Vietnam. The numbers are controversial, but many experts agree that at least as many Vietnam veterans took their lives after the war as died in it. And some veterans groups argue that as many as 3 times as many, 150,000 or so Vietnam veterans took their lives after that war. And it wasn't just the veterans that suffered from these failed policies. Our entire society was affected as thousands of families were destroyed, communities victimized, and millions of dollars of tax money spent on incarceration that only exacerbated the problem. As we now turn to look at the returning generation of veterans, as Jerry noted, about 2.5 million, or as of the summer of 2012, 2.6 million Americans had served in Iraq or Afghanistan. And according to a government study released that summer of 2012, around 500,000 are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, another 500,000 or so from traumatic brain injury. And the study itself acknowledges that because of the underreporting and the delayed onset of symptoms in many veterans, these numbers are almost certainly low. And the suicide rates are currently on track to eclipse those of the Vietnam generation. The active duty military today is reporting an average of 1 suicide per day, more than we're losing to combat in Afghanistan. And the VA, as Jerry noted, alarmingly, is reporting an average of 22 veterans taking their own lives across America today. We always like to point out that American women have served in these conflicts like never before. Over 300,000 have now served in the war zones. They're serving in combat roles like never before and serving well. 2 women in these conflicts have even been awarded the Silver Star, one of the highest awards for bravery, the first time women have ever been awarded those honors. And they're suffering right alongside the men. The VA estimates roughly 20% of women who served in the combat zones have a PTSD diagnosis, right on par with their male counterparts. Many of us that work in this area are concerned, I would say even convinced, that the PTSD rates from Iraq and Afghanistan are going to eclipse those from Vietnam. In Vietnam and other wars, we had a draft, and we made sure that we drafted enough people to spread the burden of the fighting over many more shoulders. In Vietnam, a draftee served 1 12-month tour in combat, and then their obligation was up and they came home. A few served more than 1 tour, but statistically they were a very small percentage. Today, however, we don't have a draft. We've been fighting these wars on a credit card in many respects, and no more so than in human bodies. We are recycling the same soldiers into combat over and over and over again in order to avoid the political complications that would come with a draft. And as a result, we now have a generation of veterans in which 2 and 3 combat tours are commonplace, not just in the active duty, but within the Army National Guard and reserves as well. And within the ground combat forces of the active duty, the Army and Marines in particular, that are under heaviest demand, we're seeing many more deployments, 4, 5, 6, 7, even 8 full year-long deployments documented among some of our troops. And within the special operations community, who have been silently fighting the very tip of the spear of this war, we're seeing even more deployments. These folks typically serve shorter but more intensely violent deployments. And among that population, we're seeing deployments up into the teens, 12 deployments, 13 deployments, 14 deployments. We've never done this before in our country's history. Never deployed individual soldiers into combat as frequently and for as long as we've done with these warriors. And when these folks finally start to come home in large, significant numbers, we need to be ready for them. The military started out these wars pretty flat-footed and in denial about combat trauma, as they have every other war we fought. But over the course of the last decade, their studies confirm that not only is PTSD a real battlefield injury, but rates of PTSD climb with each additional deployment. We now all understand that PTSD is an exposure injury. The more you're exposed to combat, the more likely you are to suffer. It's just that simple. The unprecedented strain that we've been putting on our military over the last decade, I think, is pretty well symbolized by this political cartoon from the height of the Iraq War. I think it's notable that the soldier in this cartoon is a National Guardsman, because we've deployed the National Guard, again, like never before in our country's history. And also notable that the soldier in this cartoon is not complaining about the weight of all of these rucksacks piled on his back, because the culture of the military is one of service and sacrifice. As we used to say in my unit, we don't have time for snivellers. You suck it up, you drive on, and you put your own well-being and self-preservation as a secondary or less priority. So it's very frequently common for warriors who are suffering to not raise their hand and ask for help. And it's very often the back of a squad car or at the county jail that we first identify a veteran in need of help. Over the years, I've collected a lot of photos that you're seeing in this presentation, and here are a few that I found that I think are pretty good real-world analogs to the soldier in that cartoon. You can see that wear and tear pretty clearly on their faces. The good news is that over the last 4 decades since Vietnam, our society seems to have learned some valuable lessons. Today, whether or not we support the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, we don't blame the troops. We recognize that in a healthy democracy, we don't want a politicized military. We recognize that it's elected leaders responsible for decisions to deploy troops into combat, not the men and women who dutifully and selflessly carry out orders. So this time around, we support our troops. At least that's what the bumper stickers say. And our goal in this advocacy is to ensure that support our troops mentality, laudable as it is, has some substance and some meaning to it, particularly in the years ahead when these troops come home and they need real support, beyond bumper stickers and yellow ribbons. Again and again, among the veterans that I work with, I hear the same refrain. It's not a hostile public that they're coming home to, as their predecessors did from Vietnam, as much as an apathetic and a disconnected public. A public that is tuned out to these wars to the extent that we were ever tuned into them. And even at the height of the Iraq War, when media coverage was ubiquitous, most veterans will tell you that what we saw was a Clorox bleached version of this war. A version that was sanitized of any blood, of any horror, so as not to upset our sensibilities. In fact, it was only recent that we were even allowed to see images of flag-draped coffins coming back from this war for fear that it would somehow upset our support for the war. So we've really largely gone blind through these wars. And the veterans that are coming home recognize this very quickly. As they say, nobody knows, nobody cares. I don't know how to begin telling my story of what I've seen and what I've done, so I don't even try. And instead, veterans often isolate themselves in much the same way Vietnam vets did in the face of the hostility they received when they came home. And we now know that isolation for someone with post-traumatic stress disorder is a killer. The best symbol I've found of that sentiment among our troops towards society and our detachment from these wars was a piece of graffiti that was pretty widely reported from the Iraq War. It was found on a blast wall in the middle of a U.S. base in Ramadi, Iraq, at the height of the violence there. An anonymous Marine had painted on a blast wall the slogan, "America is not at war. The U.S. Marine Corps is at war. America is at the mall." And that's a sentiment that I hear again and again from my clients, as I said, and it's evidence of a huge gap that I believe exists between this generation of returning veterans and the rest of our society. A gap that we have to find ways to bridge in the coming years, and that if we fail to bridge, can be very dangerous to our entire society, I believe. So the next few images I'm going to show you is criminal defense attorneys who are going to be in the trenches fighting the war at home, to have some sense of the kinds of images that are coming home in the minds of our troopers. The kinds of images that you're not seeing on CNN or in USA Today, but the images that are burned into the psyche of our clients. And along with them is some statistics to give us a sense of the intensity of the combat that they are seeing in these conflicts. They come from a study done by the U.S. Army of infantry troops coming back from their first deployment to Iraq. In that survey, responding troops indicate 94% indicated that they had received incoming small arms fire. Someone had directly tried to kill them. "48% reported they had personally killed an enemy combatant. They'd committed an act that here in our society we call murder. "51% reported they had personally handled human remains. And 28%, and this is the one that got me, 28% reported they were personally responsible for the death of a non-combatant, a woman, a child, someone not actually involved in the fight but who was nonetheless caught in the crossfire. These have been guerrilla wars in which the enemy blends in with the civilian population, launching attacks knowing our return fire will kill innocents and hoping it will help their cause. These are wars in which suicide tactics have been common throughout, leaving soldiers in the war zones on a constant sense of anxiety because anyone coming towards them could be a suicide bomber prepared to take his or her life to kill Americans. As one of my clients said, we are constantly scanning the crowds around us, trying to determine the intent. Friend, foe, friend, foe, friend, foe. Mistake a foe for a friend and you're dead. Mistake a friend for a foe and kill them, and you're burdened with guilt for the rest of your life. You've got a quarter of a second to decide over and over and over again. And when the worst happens and innocents die, the burden that comes along with that is often overwhelming for the veterans involved. In fact, experts are now coining this as a special kind of PTSD. They call it a moral injury. And in my experience, the clients who come home and suffer the most and act out the most are often those that were involved in these kinds of incidents. And the burden and guilt is driving them into self-destruction. Among those troops surveyed coming back from their first tour in Iraq, 68% reported that they had seen seriously injured or dead American troops. Again, images you're not going to see in the mainstream media, but images that have burned themselves into the psyches of the veterans who witnessed them personally. And finally, 86% reported that they had lost a friend, someone they knew personally had been injured or killed. As you process the images of the war you've just seen, keep in mind that you're seeing them in the safety of the United States, not in the 130-degree heat of Baghdad, loaded down with 85 pounds of body armor, weapons, and ammunition. The sounds of explosions and machine guns echoing around you, the screams of the injured and dying boring their way into your ears, the smell of blood and burnt flesh, cordite hanging in the air, and the knowledge that you yourself could be killed at any moment, or the knowledge that you yourself are responsible for some of the carnage in the images you've just witnessed. You think about it in that terms and you start to understand what PTSD is. It's an endless film strip of these kinds of images, sounds, smells, and emotions replaying in your head without stop. Is it any wonder so many veterans resort to self-medication with alcohol or drugs just to try to quiet their minds? And we also like to remind defenders of the prices paid by the families on the home front. The families sitting at home waiting for that horrible phone call that their loved one has been injured in combat, or worse yet, people in uniform showing up at their front door with news their loved one has been killed. easy to see how those experiences, particularly when the worst happens, could drive these folks into mental health and substance abuse issues that could bring them into the criminal court system, and we would hope they be shown the same level of compassion we're arguing be shown for the veterans themselves. Stepping back now, I think it's important that we have a very big picture view of what we're dealing with and what's coming, because Vietnam was not the first conflict to produce post-traumatic stress disorder. As we note in our book, the Defending Veterans book, PTSD is as old as war. And the more we know about post-traumatic stress disorder from a scientific standpoint, the more scholars are going back in history and finding very clear depictions of combat trauma in sources as old as the Greek classics. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, we now recognize, are not just full of depictions of combat trauma in exactly the way, say, it's manifested in veterans today. But some scholars, including Dr. Jonathan Shea, one of the contributors to our book, argue that these are stories that are about combat trauma, that at their root, the themes of these stories are about the psychological, spiritual, and emotional effects of war on the warrior throughout the ages. And what we know as PTSD today has gone by a lot of names over the centuries. In the 17th century in Europe, military doctors began to diagnose PTSD as a battlefield injury for the first time. They had no idea how to treat it, but they began coming up with names for it, like nostalgia, homesickness. The Spanish military had a term, estar roto, which translates roughly into being broken. By the American Civil War, we were calling it soldier's heart, an irritable heart. By World War I, shell shock, and by World War II, the more clinical term, combat fatigue, that took us all the way up through the Vietnam War to 1980, when PTSD was first formally recognized as the term that has carried us to today. The term 1,000-yard stare is often associated with combat trauma as well, and its origin is in this painting by a Time Life war correspondent, Tom Lee, who embedded with Marines in the fighting in the South Pacific during World War II. His painting, The 2,000-Yard Stare, depicts a young Marine after days of fighting in the Battle of Peleliu. We see a very similar look in the eyes of many of our modern-day soldiers today. This slide is one of the most recent additions to my talk, and I found it, when I first found it, I didn't immediately recognize that all three panes of this slide show the same individual. I didn't immediately recognize it as the same guy, and then when I did, I assumed that he must have aged 10 years during the course of these three photos. In reading the caption, however, I learned that the photographer took these photos within a 12-month time frame. The first photo on the left is a photo of this trooper immediately before his first deployment to Afghanistan. The middle photo, a photo taken during that deployment, and the third photo taken immediately after his return 12 months later. All three photos taken within a year, and I think probably the best evidence I've seen of the impact of intense combat on an individual. A lot of the veterans that you'll work with dislike the term PTSD. As one of my clients, a big Marine infantryman, said, it sounds like a venereal disease, and it was a big part of his objection to the diagnosis. He's not alone. Military commanders and even leadership within the psychiatric community are now pushing to change the name of the term PTSD to get rid of the D, the disorder part. As one general was quoted as saying, if we can all agree this is a legitimate battlefield injury, which we can, why do we call this a disorder? If you are shot, you don't have a gunshot disorder. If you lose a leg to an improvised explosive device, you don't have a blast disorder. Why do we call this a disorder? The move now is to reterm this term post-traumatic stress injury or combat stress injury, recognizing legitimacy of it and that it's not the fault of those suffering. One veteran I read quoted saying, PTSD is a name drained of poetry and blame. He prefers the old Civil War term soldier's heart because in his mind it connotates a disorder of warriors, not men and women who were weak or cowardly, but who followed orders and at a young age put their feelings aside and performed unimaginable tasks. I don't think it could be said any better. We also recognize that different cultures have dealt with combat trauma in very different ways, many of them far ahead of us. One of our chapters of the book looks at the way indigenous cultures around the world have dealt with combat trauma, noting that Native American tribes often segregated their warriors for days or weeks after battle, during which time they would undergo spiritual cleansing rituals that, in the words of one tribe, were intended to lift the blood guilt off the shoulders of the individual warriors and to spread it across the entire tribe. Only when the elders deemed them ready were warriors reunited with their families and the tribe and moved on with their lives. Practices that in many ways are starting to be mirrored by the U.S. military and the VA system. Our history of dealing with combat trauma in Western industrialized societies is unfortunately not nearly as laudable as the indigenous cultures. In fact, all the way up through World War I, it was commonplace for those suffering combat trauma to be labeled as cowards or deserters and to be executed on the front lines without trial. The British government in 2006 recognized this fact when it posthumously pardoned over 300 of its own soldiers from World War I who had been executed on the front lines of Europe, recognizing today that they very likely suffered from post-traumatic stress. And by all accounts, World War I was a watershed event in the era of warfare. This was the first industrialized war with machine guns and tanks and long-range artillery. And most importantly for our purposes, the first war that ground on 24/7, 365. And we believe that that factor, more than all of the others, led to an unprecedented rate of psychiatric casualties in that war. The British government alone documented over 200,000 severely disabled soldiers coming home to Britain after the war. They didn't have any place to house this many people. They were out of beds in all of their hospitals, and they had to commandeer hotels and resorts just to find a place to keep these folks. And when we did try to treat these ailments back in this era, the treatments themselves looked a lot more like torture than what we would call treatment today. There was a passage we found in a book called The War of Nerves, Soldiers and Psychiatrists in the 20th Century, in which a French military doctor describes the treatment of a 24-year-old private for his war-related mental illness. He indicated the private had been strapped in a chair while strong electricity had been applied to his neck and throat. Lit cigarettes had been placed on the top of his tongue and hot plates placed in the back of his mouth, all to help him get over his trauma. Speaking of his own treatment of the private, he said that after a few more hours of electricity, the patient could say awe, then whisper, then stammer, but just when it seemed to be working, the patient developed a tremor in his left arm. This too was attacked with electricity, but it had to be chased from the right arm, the left leg, and the right leg, with each part similarly treated. That's our history of dealing with combat trauma. Is it any wonder that there's still a taboo and a stigma within the armed forces regarding these issues? A generation later, as we prepared for World War II, the military sought the advice of mental health professionals to try to avoid the psychiatric casualties we'd seen in World War I. And in that era, mental health professionals were of the impression that if you were of a sound mind and character, you could experience any amount of combat and you would be okay. Only those with mental or moral defects, as they termed it, were, in their opinion, subject to combat trauma. And as a result of that thinking, the U.S. military screened out over 1.6 million draftees in the lead up to the war. So we only sent off 1.6 million draftees who had either a prior criminal record or diagnosed mental health issue. So we only sent off our strongest and most sound character individuals to fight in World War II, and we were convinced we were going to avoid psychiatric casualties this time around. Unfortunately, it didn't work out that way, and the military's own statistics confirm that over 500,000 American troops were discharged and sent home over the course of the war because of psychiatric collapse. At the height of the war, we were discharging soldiers as psychiatric casualties faster than we could draft and train replacements to send to the front. And probably the most alarming of the studies in World War II was one done by the Army of troops who landed on Normandy Beach on D-Day and fought their way into France. Army psychiatrists on the battlefield during the Normandy offensive found that of those who survived the first 60 days, 98% were deemed psychiatric casualties. The other 2% were deemed sociopathic or psychopathic personalities. This tells us everything we need to know. Everyone has their breaking point. If you see enough combat for long enough, you will break down unless you show up to the war already broken. An important figure to come out of World War II in this context is Audie Murphy, the most decorated U.S. soldier in World War II, came home an instant hero, ticker tape parades, a Hollywood movie contract. He went on to become the Brad Pitt of his generation. But 20 years later, during the war in Vietnam, Audie went public with the fact that he had suffered from severe combat trauma ever since coming home. He admitted sleeping with a loaded handgun under his pillow every night since the war. He admitted to numerous acts of domestic violence against his 3 wives since the war. And he called himself a chronic alcoholic and prescription drug addict. Audie went public when he did because in the mid-1960s he had finally started to receive psychiatric care, and he benefited from it greatly. And he realized that there was no need to live in the hell that he had spent the last 20 years in, and that it was his duty as the hero's hero to eliminate the stigma around this condition so that his brothers and sisters from World War II could get help, and also the veterans that were just beginning to come home from Vietnam with the same conditions get help as well. Audie went public with his story and is credited largely with getting the American government, the military, the VA, starting to move with looking at caring for psychiatric casualties. So that's the history of combat trauma. I'm going to shift quickly into how it leads to criminal behavior, because that's where the rubber really meets the road with this presentation. It's fairly simple, folks. Our veterans are coming home with these invisible injuries. They're not being diagnosed and treated in many cases, and they're falling into self-destructive, reckless, and violent behavior. Occasionally, you'll run into veterans suffering acute flashbacks or dissociative episodes in which they're reliving a combat experience in the moment, a very dangerous situation for all involved. And we're also seeing studies starting to show potential ties between traumatic brain injuries and impulsive violence. The thought in these studies is that certain parts of the brain are more fragile than others, and a mild TBI may damage these fragile parts, leaving the rest intact. One of the most fragile parts of the brain is the hippocampus, the part of the brain that helps you screen your environment for threats and identify those that are life-threatening versus those that are minor. And when the hippocampus is damaged, that perception can be altered, and a veteran can perceive a non-threat or a minor threat as life-threatening. And if you're a seasoned combat veteran, you respond to a life-threatening threat instantly with overwhelming violence. That's what keeps you alive in the war zone. It's also what gets you into a heck of a lot of trouble back here in the States. We found a great deal of evidence of post-war veteran-committed crime waves in the historical research that's now being done. I'm going to move through these quickly, and you can read more about these in the materials, but there's ample evidence, beginning with the wake of the Civil War, showing that the war had let the genie out of the bottle and the violence of the war spilled into civilian society in the years after it. Some of the best evidence of this comes from the prisons in the northern states that were keeping tabs on numbers. The Pennsylvania State Penitentiary in particular chronicled a large wave of veterans coming into the prison in the months and the year after the Civil War ended. Across the United States in 1866, 2/3 of all prison commits in the northern states that were keeping accurate records, 2/3 were combat veterans straight off the battlefields of the Civil War. In the South and in the West, where they weren't keeping as accurate a record, we know from newspapers and other anecdotal evidence that this was a period of chaos. Many veterans of the Confederate Army left and became outlaws. Jesse James, probably the most famous among them. Jesse and his brother Frank fought for a Confederate guerrilla outfit, essentially a special operations unit, whose job was to go behind Union lines, to derail trains and rob banks and anything else they could do to disrupt the Union war effort. When the war ended, they didn't go home. Instead, they recruited other men from their unit and formed the James Gang and took their talents from the war and headed west. And we know the rest of that story. And as we relook at the history of the Wild West, we're increasingly understanding that it was veterans of the Civil War that put the wild in the Wild West. And nearly every outlaw that we grew up hearing about as kids was probably someone suffering from combat trauma from the intense battles of the Civil War. Following World War I, we saw an even larger and unprecedented crime wave. There's many, many books written about this, but here are a couple of the quotes that stood out in our research. One was a newspaper in 1920 in London in which the writer said that the epidemic of crimes of violence sweeping England at that time was a natural sequel to the war, and notes that an increase in crime of the same kind had followed the Napoleonic Wars, both in Britain and in France. Here in the United States, the president of the Institute of Criminal Law and Criminology devoted his address in 1919 to the veteran crime wave sweeping America, noting that newspapers of the time were filled with accounts of crimes of such daring and boldness as to make the average citizen stand aghast. A post-World War II study of prisons in the upper Midwest found that over a third of incoming inmates in the 3 years after World War II were veterans of that conflict. And we're also beginning to realize that the history of the outlaw motorcycle culture across the United States has its origin in returning combat veterans of World War II. Men who came home and realized very quickly that they didn't fit in with society anymore. And so they began forming clubs with buddies from the war, buying old surplus motorcycles from the war, and proliferating across the United States throughout the 1950s and 60s. The Hells Angels was in fact a group of Marine Raiders initially who named their unit or their club after their unit's nickname in the South Pacific. Following Vietnam, these clubs recruited actively from the ranks of returning Vietnam veterans, and many Vietnam veterans formed their own clubs and continued to proliferate to today when they're doing it all over again. Many of the veterans that I've worked with, the time I meet them in the criminal court system, have been recruited in or are in the process of being seduced into this culture. And following Vietnam, we've got probably the best statistics related to criminal behavior. A study done by the VA I cited at the beginning of the presentation found that half of the veterans being treated for PTSD in the mid-1980s had been arrested at least once. More than a third had been arrested 2 or more times, and nearly 12% convicted of felonies in just the first decade after that war. And the most recent data that comes down that ties combat trauma to criminal behavior ironically comes from the Army itself. A study done by the Army called the Epidemiological Consultation in 2009 at Fort Carson, Colorado, found that there was no correlation to no statistical support for what was called the bad seed theory, the old standby theory of commanders that the only ones acting out violently after returning from the war were the bad seeds, the ones who would have gotten into trouble anyway. The Epicon team, using a statistical modeling way of studying called epidemiology, found there was no correlation to the bad seed theory. Those acting out at Fort Carson came from all walks of life. Some had been in trouble before, most had not. The Epicon team found 2 factors that accurately would predict who was going to act out violently on and around Fort Carson after coming home from the war. And the 2 factors were the number of combat deployments and the intensity of the combat in those deployments. Those were the 2 factors that most depicted who was going to come home and bring their war home with them. The good news is that the military is doing something with this information. They're doing more to screen and treat psychiatric casualties on the battlefield than ever before. The VA has exponentially expanded its mental health treatment capacity over the last decade, and they found treatments that do truly work. The catch with these treatments, most of which involve the idea of exposure therapy, of bringing up the trauma and processing it, are traumatic in and of themselves. And initially, veterans often feel worse, not better, as they begin this treatment, and many walk away from it without the VA being able to stop them. That's why I think a criminal justice contact can be an intervention opportunity here, because now you have a way to keep the veteran in the treatment until they will see the benefit of it. Giving them the option of a straight jail sentence or going to treatment, most will take the treatment, even though it's going to involve hard work. The greatest challenge that the VA still has is the stigma among veterans, getting them to admit that they have a problem and to accept help for it. The RAND Corporation did a study a few years ago that identified bases for this resistance: feared loss of respect among peers, concerns about security clearances and promotions, and what I call Superman syndrome. Just the byproduct of the intense psychological conditioning our troops have been put through to prepare them for combat makes them think in many cases that they can and should be able to handle any problem on their own, and that failure to do so is failure as a warrior. Survivor's guilt is another barrier to getting help in many cases. Veterans who've lost friends in combat feel they don't deserve to get help and don't deserve to be happy in life because their buddies didn't get that chance. And many are also burdened by shame of those innocent civilian deaths that I talked about earlier. that, again, weigh them down and make them think they don't deserve to get help and don't deserve to be happy in life because of what they did overseas in an impossible situation. Shifting gears now into how to apply all of this in the criminal courtroom, I'm going to touch on the high points. First and foremost, the prosecutor should be made aware of your veteran client's military service and psychological injuries. In many cases, it can have a dramatic impact on the charging decision. It may cause the prosecutor to defer charges altogether, as I've had happen in many of my cases. As far as defenses go, there's a range of them. First and foremost, obviously, is the insanity defense. If you're in a state that has a McNaughton standard, you're limited mostly to dissociative flashbacks. But in states with the broader ALI-based standard, there's a lot more room to maneuver. And in our book, we have a chapter on the Jesse Brachter trial, the first successful PTSD defense of an Iraq vet charged with murder. This is a case out of Oregon. And Mark Usario, Mr. Brachter's attorney, authored a chapter on taking that case to trial and winning it. Self-defense is another one in which PTSD can be relevant. And many states, including my home state of Minnesota, have a subjective element to the self-defense standard that can take into account a veteran's altered perceptions of the amount of danger he or she is in and the amount of force necessary to defend themselves. Automatism, or essentially sleepwalking, may be a basis for defense. And finally, short of an actual defense, it might be PTSD may provide a basis for mens rea, mitigation of culpability. In other words, arguing that a first-degree murder charge, that the veteran lacked specific intent for the first-degree element of the charge, and perhaps is guilty only of manslaughter. The key to a successful defense of veterans is always going to be experts. You want to find someone not only who is an expert on post-traumatic stress, but if possible, with a military emphasis, someone who is used to dealing with veterans. Dr. Ernie Boswell, the author of our Forensic PTSD chapter, is himself a Vietnam combat veteran who worked for over 20 years in the VA as a psychologist before going into private practice. He is the archetype in my mind of the kind of expert you want for a case like this. And there are other fields of expertise that are relevant, including what's called the total military institution. Another of our contributors, Dr. Bud Brown, a sociologist as well as a Vietnam combat veteran, talks about the effects of military training and conditioning on the perceptions of veterans into dangerous situations and the way that they respond to it. Mr. Brown's testimony in the Jesse Brachter trial was widely viewed as a very important part of his successful defense. Most of the time, though, you're going to be putting a veteran's military service and psychological state into the sentencing portion of their case. That is where this really, really comes to the fore. And it is all about telling the veteran's story and telling it in a compelling way that makes the judge, the prosecutor, want to do something better for your client. If your client has legitimate psychological injuries, they have a story to tell, period. It's your job to find it and to convey it in as compelling manner as possible. Vanessa indicated in her introduction of me that I had helped pass a statute in Minnesota. This is the text of it. It's pretty short and simple. But what it does is it provides a roadmap for judges to encourage them to consider a therapeutic alternative to incarceration sentence for a veteran. It doesn't force judges to do anything in a particular case or empower them to do anything that they aren't already empowered to do, but simply to reach out and communicate effectively with the local VA and find out what treatments are available and to incorporate those treatments into a probationary sentence. The year after we passed our statute in Minnesota, we got a big boost from the U.S. Supreme Court. They handed down in 2009 a landmark decision called Porter v. McCullum. This was the first time the U.S. Supreme Court had ever addressed the role of combat trauma in a criminal case. The case involved George Porter, a Korean War veteran with a long history of PTSD, who in the mid-1980s in a drunken rage murdered his ex-girlfriend and her new boyfriend. He was tried in the Florida courts with a young public defender assigned to represent him. George was so traumatized even 3 decades after his war that he couldn't and wouldn't talk about it. And though his public defender knew he had served in Korea, Because George wasn't willing to talk about it, that's as far as it went. And there was no evidence presented at the trial or the sentencing phase of the case regarding Mr. Porter's military service or the trauma that he experienced after coming home. And as a result, the jury in Florida gave George the death penalty. Fortunately, that wasn't the end of the story. And a few years later, a group of Florida appellate public defenders took George's case up on post-conviction relief. They did what his original trial attorney had failed to do. They obtained his military records, tracked down men he had served with in Korea, and his family members, and held a multi-day hearing in the Florida courts in which they brought all of these witnesses in to testify to the horror of the combat that George experienced in Korea, and to the dramatic changes in his personality after he came home. The Florida courts didn't care much about this evidence, and they upheld George's death penalty. But the case made its way up through the appellate system, and when it finally landed with the U.S. Supreme Court, they did care. In fact, they cared so much that they unanimously overturned George's death penalty in an era when this court doesn't do much of anything unanimously. They found that George's original trial attorney's failure to bring this evidence into the trial was ineffective assistance of counsel. And they put a huge burden on the defense bar to do this work whether our clients are really helping out or not. We've got to go out and find this evidence. We've got to find the military documents, the witnesses, and bring them into court. It's just simply our job. The heart of the decision, the court notes that it's not just the relevance of the extensive combat experience and extreme hardship and gruesome conditions, but that a jury might find mitigating the intense stress and mental and emotional toll that combat took on Porter. And it was at the end of this passage that they cited in a footnote to Minnesota's veteran sentencing statute, as well as California, the other state that had passed one at that time. In the wake of this decision, we in Minnesota that were part of passing our legislation started to get a lot of phone calls from folks around the country interested in passing legislation of their own. And that is what got us involved in this national level advocacy, helping several states pass legislation either identical or very similar to Minnesota's. The next step in the evolution of more effectively dealing with veterans in the criminal court system has been the Veterans Court movement. This is an exploding movement. The first court was started in 2008 by Judge Robert Russell in Buffalo, New York. Judge Russell authors the chapter of our book about veterans courts, and as he notes, the numbers have been growing exponentially in the past several years. There are now 160 active veterans courts in the United States with, as I understand it, nearly 300 in the planning stages. You're going to hear from Karen, our Veterans Justice Outreach Specialist, here shortly, that's going to go into a lot more detail about how veterans courts work. The main thing is that it's like a drug court or a mental health court, but the VA is a direct active participant in the court through the Veterans Justice Outreach Program that Karen is a part of. The VA is reaching out to the criminal courts at the same time the courts are reaching out to the VA, and a very unique partnership has evolved in the last few years that has saved the lives of many of my own clients and thousands more across the country. And in winding down, the one thing I want to leave everyone with is, as attorneys working with veterans, we're walking a fine line. We're dealing with people, in many cases, who are dealing with very significant mental health issues. And of course, we do not want to practice mental health care without a license, and many attorneys don't know where to draw the line there. Evan Simone, an Army JAG officer, writes a chapter in our book about the role of lawyer as counselor. And as he notes, it's inevitably going to be part of our responsibility to serve in a counseling role with our clients. In many cases, we're going to be the first ones to identify in them potential combat trauma that they need help for. It's incumbent upon us to talk to them about these issues, help them overcome stigmas and resistance to talking to the VA, and get them in to see mental health professionals who can actually care for them. We also have to be sensitive to the fact that a criminal charge could be the final straw for a veteran already on the verge of giving up hope. And we have to be very sensitive to the fact that throughout the case there are what Evan Simone refers to as psycho-legal IEDs that we need to know could cause our veteran client great stress, and we need to take steps to prepare them for that. We also need to be prepared for dealing with self-destructive legal decision making. A veteran may say, I didn't do this crime, but I did bad things over in the war, so I need to go down for this. I need to take responsibility for this, even when from a legal standpoint, maybe he or she doesn't. And we also need to be prepared for that suicide call. And unfortunately, I have had several. And we've got to learn psychological first aid techniques to keep our veterans alive and get them through the court process. We also, I think, need to recognize the costs that come with working with veterans on a regular basis. All of us in the defense community work with people who are under a great amount of stress and trauma. And it's really easy to absorb that stress and to absorb that trauma when we're right next to them in the foxhole fighting that fight. And if you're dealing with a lot of veterans, this starts to be an issue that can build up. And one thing that I've learned in my practice is that mental health professionals that work with veterans in trauma automatically see a counselor of their own to unload this weight that they're constantly accumulating so that they can effectively do their job in the long run. We in the defense community don't do that, in my experience, and it's something that I think we need to seriously take a look at. We're not going to be able to help this generation of veterans in the long run if we're not helping ourselves and keeping ourselves healthy. As I said, this book that we've just published, The Attorney's Guide to Defending Veterans in Criminal Court, is a 3-year project. The book has just become available. There are experts from all across the country in the areas of law, medicine, psychology, sociology, criminology, and history who've each contributed a chapter on their area of expertise to this book. It's a 24-chapter, 700-page treatise, 200-page appendix. Everything that we felt a defense attorney should have at their disposal to effectively represent veterans in criminal court. And in publishing this book, we've also formed a nonprofit called the Veterans Defense Project to carry on this advocacy and education in the coming years. More information about our program and if you're interested in ordering the book, you can do so at the Veterans Defense Project website at veteransdefenseproject.org. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. My name is Carrington. I'm the Veterans Justice Outreach Specialist at the Washington, D.C. VA Medical Center. I'd like to thank Vanessa for her introduction and Mr. Cox and Mr. Ware for inviting me to speak today to the NADCL. I'm going to speak to you on the Veterans Justice Outreach Program and how we work to assist veterans dealing with the criminal justice system. I think it's appropriate that I follow Brock because he spoke on what happens when veterans go to war and the issues and the things that they experience. And I come in after they return from war when they're beginning to receive services through the VA Medical Center. We often encounter veterans and their families who say that the veteran is a different person than when he or she joined the military. They were once very social, they like to interact with people, they love to be around family and friends, be out in public, and when they returned, the person was very isolated. They didn't like crowds, they didn't like traveling, they didn't like going to restaurants, movie theaters. They didn't interact with their families. They were very angry. They were often very angry with their children, with their spouses. So we're seeing that the veterans are very different from when they went to war. Post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic brain injury, and general readjustment issues sometimes manifest themselves in veterans as crisis encounters with law enforcement. We often see veterans who are getting into situations where they're in public, they're not able to control themselves, they're very angry, they're often stopped by the police, get into altercation with friends, with loved ones. Oftentimes alcohol or drugs are involved. And in these encounters, when law enforcement are called, the veteran is still very angry and may not respect law enforcement when they approach them. So they get into a situation where they're now in a confrontation situation with the police. And sometimes this can end very ugly. Sometimes when we have police that have been receiving training or understanding of veterans' issues, they know how to diffuse the situation possibly and maybe contact the VA to see what we can do to help the veteran. Behaviors we are seeing. Risky behavior to get an adrenaline rush. We see a lot of veterans doing things like skydiving, speed racing, drag racing. They're engaging in speeding, erratic driving, road rage. They're also having issues with alcohol, domestic violence, child abuse. We're also seeing animal cruelty. They're also having many addictions: drugs, food, sex, alcohol, gambling, anything to get an adrenaline rush. When you're in a combat situation, you're always on the go. You have to be alert at all times. And so when they come back to society where everything is just 9 to 5, they kind of can't adjust to this kind of situation. We're also seeing a lot of them with anger, unpredictability, aggression. Again, we're seeing this in work. We're seeing this towards their family members, towards their children. We're also seeing it again in animal cruelty. Many charges they're getting: DUI, DWIs, theft, petty theft. Veterans are going into stores stealing things like lipstick and makeup when they're not women or they're not cross-dressers. They really don't have any reason for stealing these things, but many times they're considered nuisance crimes. We're seeing a lot of assault and battery charges, a lot of domestic violence and child abuse with our veterans, where spouses are saying that anything they say sets them off. They'll be in bed and the veteran will wake up and start choking them. The children, who are naturally rambunctious, they're causing them to just the anger to come forward, so they're not able to control that. We're also seeing a lot of veterans with previous charges who are in some way are violating their charges, whether it be drug possession, whether it be not following through with treatment that they were ordered to attend, so they're getting a lot of violations. Again, drug possession, sales, and intent to distribute. Some veterans, they talk about not being able to find a job, so they're resorting to selling drugs to make a living. Also, we've seen a lot of trespassing, open containers, and this is mostly amongst our homeless veterans. Or also a lot of panhandling, where they're in public, sleeping in public parks, sleeping in front of buildings, and it's really a bother to customers and businesses. We're also seeing veterans with murder charges. Again, it could be a spouse, it could be an acquaintance. If they're in public, at a bar or something, and there's alcohol involved and they get into an altercation with another patron, or if it's their friend that the alcohol and the anger, it explodes, and the next thing you know, somebody is wounded fatally. We're also seeing a lot of veterans dealing with sex offenses, anything from child pornography to rapes, molestation. We're seeing a lot of that. So the purpose of the VJO program is to avoid the unnecessary criminalization of mental illness and substance abuse amongst veterans. I'm recognizing that the veterans do have a lot of issues when they're coming back from tour of duties, and they're maybe not being addressed because the veteran isn't acknowledging them as an issue. They're having a lot of interactions, again, with the public, with the justice system. And in many times, they've never been diagnosed with anything because for some veterans, they will not deal with the VA, sometimes justified, sometimes unjustified, where they're not interested in working with us to address their issues. Sometimes they're going to private doctors and they're not telling the doctors a lot of their symptoms. So we see a lot of interaction with that. Justice-involved veterans include veterans in contact with law enforcement who can appropriately be diverted to treatment in lieu of incarceration, veterans in jail, detained, pretrial, or serving a sentence, and veterans involved in adjudication or monitoring through the courts. So we're seeing veterans who have been charged or they're in jail or if they've been released, but we're also seeing veterans who have been convicted and they may have had a long prison sentence. I work with the veterans who are pretrial. Each VA also has a veteran who, an employee who works with the veterans who have been sentenced and are due to be released. And those are the incarcerated veterans reentry specialists. So each VA medical center will have a justice outreach specialist and an incarcerated veterans reentry specialist. Basic eligibility for VA health care. If they have served in the active military, naval, air service, and are separated under any condition other than dishonorable, they'll be eligible for services through the VA. Current or former members of the Reserve and National Guard called to active duty. Now this is very important because sometimes I'll go to a jail to meet with a veteran and see that he was a reservist or a National Guard and he was never activated. That veteran would not be eligible for services through the VA. But with the two current conflicts that we have, Most of them have been called to active duty from a reserve unit or National Guard. As Brock was saying, we have veterans who are serving multiple deployments. So we have reservists and National Guards who now are very eligible for services. But in those cases where I've seen veterans from the 80s, early 90s, where they were never activated, unfortunately the VA would not be able to provide them services. Veterans who enlisted after September 7, 1980 or entered active duty after October 1981 must have 2 consecutive years, 24 months, to be eligible for VA Medical Center services. This is very important because many times we'll get calls from lawyers asking if somebody would be eligible for services through the VA. And when we look up their service, if I see that a veteran is 14 days short of that 24 months, that person would not be eligible for services through the VA hospital. The exception to this is if somebody was injured while they were active duty and they're receiving monetary compensation from the VA, then that person would be eligible to receive services through a VA medical center. So how does the VJO program work? What is it that we do? One thing is that we serve veterans of all era. It's not restricted to veterans in this current conflict in Iraq and Afghanistan. If it's World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the first Persian Gulf War, we'll service veterans who were in any conflict. We assess veterans' health care needs, identify appropriate VA and non-VA services. Again, if I meet with a veteran at a jail and the veteran is not eligible for VA services, what I'll try to do is find a community service that the veteran could receive services from. Here in Maryland, we have Maryland's Commitment to Veterans, who they will pay for a veteran to receive mental health and substance abuse services if that person is not eligible to come to a VA hospital for care. And in many jurisdictions, in many states, you all may have a program as well that a veteran could receive services even if they're not eligible for care through the VA hospital. We also refer and link veterans to comprehensive health care services. So our purpose is to assist veterans with mental health and substance abuse services. But also part of that, since we are part of the VA Medical Center, we want to make sure that the veteran, whatever services they may need in terms of medical care, if it's housing assistance, employment assistance, we want to make sure that we can do something to provide those services as well. So we let the courts know that we also have services to help homeless veterans and veterans seeking employment. With the veteran's consent, we communicate attendance in programs and treatment to the courts. What's important with the VA is that the veterans sign a release of information form so that we can provide that information to the court system so that they know if the courts have agreed to allow a veteran to go into treatment through the VA, that the veteran is compliant with that treatment. So many times when I go to the jail, I meet with veterans who have never come to the VA before. So part of what we have to do is get them enrolled at the VA hospital. First, I verify that they are eligible. We do that by their social security number, verifying that the person did serve and how long they served, and if they are eligible based on the type of discharge they got. Sometimes veterans do not have a copy of their military discharge papers, their DD-214, so what we do is assist them with requesting a copy so that they can complete the enrollment process. There's also a financial form that's required to enroll at the VA, so we fill out that paperwork with the veteran, and when they have their DD-214 and the enrollment packet, we then proceed to get them enrolled at the medical center for care. Some of the things that we can't do as VJO specialists, we can't perform psychiatric or psychological evaluations for the court. Meaning, just yesterday I got a call from a veteran saying that he needed a forensic psychologist report. I had explained to him that the VA does not provide forensic evaluations. That's something that he would have to request that his lawyer get for him. The VA provides services for treatment through the VA hospital. So if the veteran is in need of mental health services, we can definitely provide that, and we have the doctors who will document what they're finding. At any point, a veteran is able to get copies of their medical records, and if their lawyer requests it, with the veterans, again, signing a release form, their lawyer can have a copy of any medical records that the VA has, if they want to use that towards their defense. We also don't accept custody for veterans. All VA programs are voluntary, so a veteran has to be accepting of coming to a program. They can't be court ordered to attend treatment by the VA because we have no enforcement capabilities. We also, while I have picked veterans up from a jail to go into residential treatment, I don't accept custody of the veteran. The veteran has to be released by the court to attend treatment with the understanding that the VA in no way can keep a veteran if the veteran chooses to leave. We also can't accept veterans who are on ankle monitors, again, because we have no enforcement. We also can't guarantee acceptance into residential treatment or outpatient treatment. The VA provides residential substance abuse and mental health treatment, but it's not something as the Justice Outreach Specialist that we can guarantee the courts that the person will be accepted. There's generally a screening committee that will meet with the veteran, or they will do a phone interview with them if the veteran is in a jail so that they can talk with the veteran and see the veteran's appropriateness for treatment. We also don't write lengthy court reports or complete diversion paperwork. For those jurisdictions that do have veterans treatment courts, the Justice Outreach Specialist that is part of the court, they do a court report for the treatment court. But in general, the Justice Outreach Specialists that don't have veterans treatment courts are not doing lengthy court reports. We also don't advocate for legislation as federal employees. So listed here are many of the services that the VA Medical Center provides. That's anything from hospital care, outpatient treatment, dental, pharmacy, prosthetic services. We also have nursing homes and contract assisted living facilities for veterans. We also have specialized care for female veterans, as well as sexual trauma counseling. We also provide, like I said, assistance with employment and housing services. The VA partnered with Housing and Urban Development to provide vouchers, housing vouchers for veterans. So each jurisdiction gets a certain amount of vouchers each year, as well as the compensated work therapy program for veterans who are in need of employment. Many times we'll have veterans who have been in jail for umpteen years, and they're coming out and they don't have any job experience, they don't have a resume. So what the VA does is employ them either through a VA medical center, or it could be another government agency where they'll receive job skills training, interview training. They'll be sent out on interviews. They're also compensated and required to put part of their earnings in a savings account for when the program ends. And at the end of that, the hope is that the veteran will find full-time employment. Many times the veteran may be hired by the VA hospital, or again, another government agency that they saw that they had good work performance. The VA also provides vocational rehabilitation, where the VA will provide equipment for a veteran to go to school. Many times that's a laptop that's needed, and also compensation while they're in a school program. Also, there's the vet centers, which are community centers for post-traumatic stress disorder. They're affiliated with the VA, but the VA, we don't share our records with them. And this is on purpose, because many times veterans returning from the Vietnam era, again, did not trust the VA. So they wanted to be able to receive PTSD treatment without having their records available to the VA. There also, again, was the stigma: if they're reporting this, then it could be held against them with a job, employment, federal employment. So the vet centers were really a safe place for the veterans to go to get counseling, PTSD counseling. They also provide military sexual trauma counseling at vet centers. So again, each jurisdiction will have a vet centers. In this area, we have about 5 vet centers that veterans can go to. So the referral process: if a veteran is dealing with the criminal justice system, you say, how do you find out about it? We get referrals from all kinds of sources. I get calls from judges, judges' clerks, from defense attorneys, even the prosecutor's office will call us. We'll get calls from parents, spouses, children, If a veteran somehow notifies their medical provider, the medical provider will let us know that the veteran said that he was arrested, or the veteran hasn't been seen for weeks and they've missed appointments. We start making phone calls and find out that the veteran has been arrested. So the source can come from anywhere. The VA does require a release of information for us to speak with attorneys, court personnel, and to provide verification to the court of a veteran's eligibility for services. When I meet with the veteran at the jail, that's one of the first things I do is have them sign the release so that I can speak with an attorney. When we get calls from attorneys without the release, all we can do is talk in general about what services the VA provides. We can't tell the attorney that the veteran has been diagnosed with something or that they're in treatment at this time. We can only do that after the veteran has given written consent. If I speak with the veteran and they say they want me to talk with an attorney, I'll take the verbal consent and then speak with the attorney and then still have them sign the release so that we have it for our records. At that point, we ascertain what it is the veteran needs, what kind of services, what kind of assistance. Again, we're seeing all kind of offenses from DUIs to drug charges to nuisance charges. And we find out at the time of the arrest were drugs or alcohol in any way involved in the incident. If a veteran tells me that yes, it was, then we let them know what services we have. Again, it's outpatient or residential. Depending on the veteran's addiction, an outpatient program may suffice. However, some veterans with the addiction they have access going home daily to whatever they were facing before they came for treatment is too much. So they would prefer to do residential treatment where it's a more structured environment and visitors are limited, passes to leave the facility are limited, and they also do drug and alcohol testing. So if that's what is recommended based on the needs of the veteran, then we'll make a referral for outpatient or residential treatment. With all of our services, for residential treatment, at least in this area, the facilities want to know that treatment will not be interrupted so that a person has to go to court. So if I meet with a veteran and they have a court date in a month, knowing that the Perry Point VA's residential treatment is 100 days, I will then request through the attorney that the court date be postponed while the veteran attends treatment, so there's no interruption of treatment. Generally, this is always honored by the courts where they'll go ahead because they also want the person to receive treatment, so they will go ahead and postpone the court date until the veteran has completed the treatment program. We also have veterans who are in inpatient psychiatry receiving services for suicidal attempts or ideations. And again, they may have court dates that are coming up, but we want to send them to residential mental health treatment, stabilization. Again, we have to request of the court that they postpone any court dates while the person is in treatment so as not to interrupt the treatment process. We also provide notification to the courts. Again, for the jurisdictions that don't have veterans courts, there's just too many jurisdictions for the justice outreach specialist to be at every court hearing. So what we do is provide a letter through the attorney verifying that the person is a veteran, verifying if they have combat service, verifying their location, and any diagnosis that may be relevant. We then let them know if the person, based on their clinical need, is appropriate for treatment, outpatient or residential. We also make sure to let them know in the letter that all VA services are voluntary, so they, again, can't be court-ordered to participate in treatment. And this is given to the judge by the defense attorney so that they're aware. In cases where there's things that we can't help with, such as murder and sex offenses, because in terms of treatment, the VA really doesn't provide sex offense treatment. There may be 1 or 2 VAs that may have a sex offense program, but generally across the country, VAs don't provide sex offense treatment. In the case of murder, there's really not going to be a diversion to treatment for murder. So in those kind of cases, what we can provide is something in terms of mitigation to, again, let the courts know The person is a veteran. These are the experiences they had while they were active duty. Just so the court is aware, not making excuses, but just making them aware of the person's experience and some of the things that they've gone through. Again, we're also the liaison between the court and the medical center. In many cases, if a person has been approved by a judge to go into treatment, outpatient or residential, then we may have pretrial or probation that may call to say, is the person being compliant with treatment? Have they shown up for their appointments? And lots of times, people will call around to multiple people and they can't find anybody that will talk to them, or they'll say continuously, I need a release form, I don't have a release, I can't speak to you. The Justice Outreach Specialist acts as that liaison between the veteran and the court. Since we have the release form, we can verify for the court that the person, yes, they have been compliant with treatment, or no, they have not shown up in the last 2 weeks. We haven't heard from him, we can't find him. We've called and sent letters, and he's not coming to treatment. We'll be the ones to let the courts know that the person is compliant or not compliant. So how can you locate the Justice Outreach Specialist for your jurisdiction? Attached is an email that lists all the Justice Outreach Specialists in a jurisdiction. Again, there's some outreach specialists who cover 20 or more counties. It'll list each location by the medical center. What you can do is contact the Justice Outreach Specialist for that specific medical center. If they're not the appropriate person, they can direct you to the appropriate Justice Outreach Specialist for that location so that you can speak with them. Also included is the veterans, for veteran services. That's anything from veterans health care and veterans benefits. Part of what we do is when I go to the jail, when I meet with veterans who either they're not eligible because of the type of discharge they have, one of the things we do is try to help them apply for an upgrade so that they would be eligible for services. Again, because without that upgrade, they would not be eligible to come to the VA Medical Center. For other veterans who they are eligible for services, but they've never applied for VA benefits, meaning they may have been injured or diagnosed with something while they were active duty, but they've never applied for benefits through the VA. What we do is also assist them with applying for compensation through the VA based off whatever disability or diagnosis that they have. We explain to them that it could take a process up to a year or more, but it's at least good to get the process started. We also assist veterans who, when a veteran is convicted and they convicted of a felony and they're serving 60 days or more in jail, whatever VA benefits they have are cut down to 10%. So if they're receiving $2,700 a month, this is now cut down to $270. For veterans with spouses and children, they want to request that their spouse, their dependents, continue to receive services or financial assistance through the VA. So we can help them with paperwork with that as well, so that their loved ones can still receive monetary assistance while the veteran is serving a sentence. After the veteran is released, then the veteran could request to have his VA benefits restarted. The other thing we can't do is provide treatment to a veteran in jail. All we can do is provide outreach because we're not allowed to do treatment to veterans in jail. So in terms of outreach, that's again, letting the courts know what we offer, letting the veterans know what's available, trying to set up services and referrals if the veteran is released so that they can receive services upon their release. In terms of the Veterans Court, again, as Brock was saying, there's over 160 veterans courts throughout the country at this time. In this jurisdiction, we have 2 courts that are in the process of being started. The Justice Outreach Program would be a part of that team, of the court team, providing the link again between the VA and the court system, verifying that a veteran is in treatment, verifying that they're compliant with treatment, if there's any issues that have come up with treatment or with the veteran's compliance, we can make the courts aware of that so that it can be dealt with accordingly in terms of sanctions or also rewards for the veteran participating and doing what they're supposed to in treatment. they've been very successful across the country in terms of the recidivism rate amongst veterans who have participated in Veterans Court. So it's actually a very, very worthwhile program to start. I don't know why it's doing that. Okay, so the last thing is my contact information for the DCVA, as well as my cell phone number and email address where I can be contacted for questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Brock, for presentations that really gave a lot of very useful information about how to help our veterans when they're involved in the criminal justice system. And that brought up a question from our live viewing audience from a criminal defense attorney's perspective. And that question is, when you have a client who is a combat veteran and you suspect that they have a psychological issue or an injury caused by their service that contributed either in whole or in part to their current charges and involvement with the criminal justice system, how do you broach that topic with your clients if the client doesn't bring it up first? And I know this is probably a very lengthy and difficult topic, but we're still going to ask Brock to start us on our journey for helping this client.
Absolutely. It's a great question, and it is a complicated one. There are a couple of chapters in the Defending Veterans book that directly answer this question on point. The pretrial preparation chapter, as well as Evan Simone's lawyer as counselor chapter. But in short, the defense attorney is walking a pretty sensitive line here. We don't want to feed a client a defense, a malingered defense here that could backfire in a variety of different ways. We only want to assert a PTSD defense or bring it up if it's a legitimate psychological injury the veteran is facing that played a role in their offense. More often than not, though, rather than dealing with clients who don't have PTSD and are falsely claiming it, in our experience, it's more often veterans who are dealing with combat trauma but are very much in denial about it. And the way that we broach that subject is by first building trust with the clients so that they're willing to open up to us a little bit about their service. And we're looking for, in that description of their service, the content, looking for signs of traumatic events that could have led to combat trauma, but also the emotional content of the way that they describe their military service often tells you as much as anything. You can tell when you're getting into territory that is bothering that veteran. It gets a lot harder to get details out of them. And if it appears that they're resistant to the idea of post-traumatic stress disorder at all, we'll oftentimes talk about some of the historical context that I do in my presentation that you've just seen, making sure that they're aware that combat trauma has been around for as long as there's been combat. And some of the most famous warriors throughout history, we now realize, suffered from it, and that they're not alone. And doing our best to eliminate the stigma around it so that they feel more comfortable sharing their experiences. When we're talking about symptomology of PTSD, we don't ask the veteran, do you think you have PTSD? We'll ask them about the various symptoms that often come with it. One of my favorite questions is, how have you been sleeping? Even if a veteran is very much in denial about his or her post-traumatic stress, you'll almost always get the answer, what sleep? What is sleep? And they'll readily admit that they don't sleep much. And that's an absolute red flag for post-traumatic stress disorder. And then we talk about, how about crowds? How do you feel about driving in public? How are you getting along with your wife and family? All of these questions, that kind of biting around the edges of the subject without taking it on head on. And as you get the answers and they start to build up, you start to make the case that, maybe you're dealing with something that relates to your military service. If I have a client who's seen really serious combat, I'll say, I'd be more worried about you if you were telling me you were unaffected by what you experienced than by telling me that you are. It tells me you're human and that you can get help. And then as we gradually build up, then it's talking about getting them in to talk to real mental health professionals, getting them in to get help at the VA, and if it's appropriate, getting them in to see a forensic psychologist to really dig into how their trauma may be related to their criminal case. And I also caution attorneys that it's not just veterans who've seen direct combat that we're dealing with here. There's a variety of ways that people serving in the military can be affected psychologically by their service. Those who are in the medical corps may never have been shot at, but saw all of the horrors of war, in many ways, often more intensely than even the grunts out on the front lines, because they're just seeing casualties all day, every day. Graves registration people who deal with the bodies of the dead troops often suffer psychologically. Those who notify families back home about injured or dead troops often feel a great deal of trauma. And women veterans, as more and more, there's more and more public dialogue about this, an alarming number of women veterans report being victims of military sexual trauma. They may never have even served in the war zone, but may have a very valid PTSD diagnosis related to being sexually abused by peers or superiors. The bottom line is you've got to dig in and really get a sense of your veteran service. You've got to document it and make sure they're telling you accurate information, and get them in to get appropriate help and talking to the right mental health experts to confirm the diagnosis. But it is a complex topic and probably one of the biggest challenges we face as defense attorneys working with veterans.
Well, thank you very much, Brock. And I just want to say thank you again to Brock Hunter and to Karen Carrington for coming here and talking about this important topic, and to giving defense attorneys and everyone related to the criminal justice system some really much needed information about how to help all of our veterans and how to support them and give them an appropriate defense. Thank you.